Welcome to the Red-Haired Archaeologist. I am your host, Amanda Hope Haley. Thank you for taking some time with me today to study artifacts our ancient Near Eastern ancestors left behind and consider if those artifacts just might change how we read or read into Scripture. Last week's episode by talking about the Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings 10, about half of it is the story of this queen going and meeting with King Solomon. And there's not a whole lot of information in the Bible about her or really even about their interactions. What is described looks like your standard state visit. She goes, she takes so many gifts for the king. It is described that she receives a lot of gifts back in return. And then she spends time sort of sitting at the feet of King Solomon, whom she had heard was incredibly wise. And it says that she asked him all sorts of questions, all of which he answered. He was very free with his time with her. But that's all that it says. It doesn't indicate that they had any sort of a romantic relationship. It really doesn't say anything more than just that. Well, as often happens in the Bible, especially when it comes to female characters, where the Bible leaves stuff out, culture and tradition and writings maybe from other cultures and traditions, what is said in those places ends up sort of filling in the blanks. And so oftentimes when people talk about the Queen of Sheba, and back in the 1950s and 60s, films that were even made about her, the Queen of Sheba becomes the sort of screen siren. We think of her as being an incredibly beautiful woman, not just rich, but beautiful. And we even think that she was one of Solomon's wives. The biblical text does not say that, but there might be a reason that all of everything that culture added in there went in that direction when it comes to the descriptions of the Queen of Sheba. And that is because of what happens in the following chapter. Well, so we meet her in chapter 10, and then at the end of the chapter, after she has gone home, there's a description of a lot of the ways that Solomon started fortifying Israel with weapons and all of those sorts of things, different structures that he was building and everything. Well, after that description, then it moves. And at the beginning of chapter 11, we read that Solomon, he had 700 international marriages and 300 international mistresses. It states King Solomon loved countless women from other countries. Again, this is separated from the narration that we have about the Queen of Sheba, but I do think that we tend to sort of ignore that little bit that's in the middle and lump all of those in together, and we imagine that the Queen of Sheba is maybe one of those 700 wives, even though, once again, the text does not state that. Well, so he did go on to have 1,000 women who were from nations that were not Israel. And while this probably was a big part of the reason that Israel had mostly peaceful times underneath Solomon, they had great alliances with the countries between them. As we know, that's what kings and queens do and have done throughout time, is you marry people from other countries in order to bring alliances and peace and prosperity to your own nation. So we see Solomon doing that. It makes sense from a human political perspective, but this infuriated God. And he told Solomon that I will remove the kingdom from your rule and hand it over to your servant after Solomon's death. Solomon didn't just marry these wives, but we're told that at the end of his life, he actually started following some of their pagan gods. He even goes so far as to build high places. Well, so this servant that Israel's going to be turned over to, his name is Jeroboam, and he's from the tribe of Ephraim. Before we talk about Jeroboam, and we're really going to get into him here in a minute, I think it's important to look at the very last few verses that have to do with King Solomon. It states that Solomon ruled from Jerusalem for 40 years. And I want you to remember that it actually says the same thing about King David, that he ruled for 40 years. But then Saul, it says, ruled for only 20 years. So in the Old Testament, numbers very often have symbolic meanings. Did Solomon rule for a literal 40 years? Did David rule for a literal 40? Did Saul rule for a literal 20? Possibly yes, but definitely those numbers have a symbolic meaning, because 40 is a number that very often is associated with completion in the Bible. Another very famous place that the number 40 comes into play is, of course, with the flood narrative. And there we see it raining for 40 days and 40 nights. The idea is that it took that amount of time for the complete destruction of humanity. So 40 has this idea of completion. And so when you see it applied to kings, then it is indicating that whatever God set out for their rule at that time, that they completed everything they were supposed to do. They did everything that they were supposed to do. And so it's really interesting to see the number 40 used for Solomon and for David and for future kings, but you only see the number 20 used for Saul, because under Saul, we see that the complete coming together of the nation of Israel, of all the tribes, didn't exactly 100% happen. His was a reign that was not complete. It was maybe halfway completed. And so when you see those numbers, especially when they're round numbers like that, think about what is that extra layer of meaning that is behind maybe the literal number of how many years someone did something. It is also stated right after that 40 number that Solomon slept with his fathers, or that he was gathered to his fathers. This phrase is used frequently throughout both books of Kings to describe the kings at their time of death. And so when good people died, they were laid to rest in the tomb with their families. And a tomb may have been a cave, like we mentioned Abraham purchasing the cave of Machpelah, which today it's in Hebron. It has the tomb of the patriarchs, this structure, this building that has been built over it. Well, underneath that building, underneath the floors, is the cave, where no one's been in there since 1981, but supposedly the bodies of Abraham, Sarah, their descendants are all under there. Well, what would happen in history, in antiquity, is when someone would die. So say when King Solomon died, he would have been laid out in his family's tomb. We don't know exactly where it was. He would have been laid out in the center of it. And ideally, the fresh body that's laid there would be left and undisturbed for a long enough time for the flesh to rot off the bones until only bones remained. Well, at a later date, somebody else would come into the tomb, likely after someone else died, maybe Solomon's son. There would be a reason for someone to enter the tomb, and they would take those bones that would now hopefully be clean and dry in the center of that tomb. They would gather those bones together, and then they would push them off into the side of the tomb. Sometimes those bones would be collected and they would go into boxes called ossuaries, or sometimes tombs would be constructed that had niches carved into the walls along the side, and those bones would just be placed in the niches. Or sometimes we even see both. The bones would be gathered together, put into an ossuary, and then the ossuary would be stuck in one of those niches. All of this is to say that when you're reading in the book of Kings that these men were gathered to their fathers or went to sleep with their fathers, what is being described is not only a euphemism for death, but it is also a description of what physically happened to corpses after they died and when they were buried. These burial practices continued not only from the time of the kings and even prior to that, as we just referenced Abraham, but all the way up through the Roman occupation of Judea. And maybe one of the most famous ossuaries at this time is something called the James Ossuary. It is from the 1st century, and it has a carving on it that says James, brother of Jesus. It was found, I was in college. It was found, I believe, in 2002. That's not true. It was actually found in the 1970s, and it was held by a collector, and then it became advertised in 2002 and led to an incredibly long court battle that at the end of it, there is still no consensus as to whether or not that ossuary, if the inscription on it relating to Jesus is actually real or a fake. In fact, the judge's ruling at the end was basically to say, I am I'm ruling on the merits of this case, but my ruling on whether or not this man did something criminal actually has no bearing on the authenticity of the ossuary. All that to say, I hope you'll take a look at the show notes, because as I always do, I'm including in the show notes all sorts of links that you can go to see these items, to read more about them, and the James ossuary is one of those. But I mention this simply because I want you to understand what it means in the books of Kings when people are gathered to their fathers. I think it's actually a really beautiful use of language there, something that is poetic for death, but then also physically describes what was happening at the time. So just after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam is preparing to be anointed king by all of Israel. Now, Jeroboam, another man, and even though his name sounds really similar, they are of no relation. Jeroboam had received a prophecy saying that he would be the king of the 10 northern tribes. After he received that prophecy, Solomon got wind of that prophecy and apparently tried to have him killed. And so Jeroboam went down to Egypt, and once he heard that Solomon had died, he came back up to the north. And he and the 10 northern tribes went to Rehoboam and said, under your father, we were practically worked to death. And so we will continue to be your loyal subjects if you will just not quite make us work so hard. We think about Solomon as being this prolific builder, which he absolutely was. Well, Solomon wasn't the one stacking all of those stones. He had all of the people of Israel do that. And so there was a level of conscripted labor happening among all of the tribes in Israel so that all of these monumental building projects could be put together. So the people are taking this opportunity to try to negotiate, better labor laws, if you want to think of it that way. Well, Rehoboam is, it seems, pretty young, and he goes and he talks to the elders, the men who were his father's advisors, and they advise him, you know what, listen to these people and make some adjustments. Then he goes and he talks to some of his, young friends, and they tell him, no, you shouldn't do that. In fact, you should come down even harder on all of the tribes and tell them that you are going to be twice the taskmaster that your father was. Well, he ends up doing that. And as you can expect, the 10 northern tribes were not very happy about that. And so the 10 northern tribes basically take their stuff and they all go home. What follows is possibly the most peaceful civil war that has ever happened. Once everyone's gone home, Rehoboam gets one of his men who was in charge of the laborers to go up to them and try to get them to come back into the fold. Well, the 10 northern tribes end up killing this man. Rehoboam goes home, he goes back to Jerusalem, he starts putting together troops and making plans to go attack those tribes and bring them back into United Israel. But he receives a message through a prophet from God that says, nope, don't do that. This is me. They are supposed to be their own kingdom from now on. You are in charge of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes, they are now going to be led by King Jeroboam. And so that's pretty much how it ends. Well, Jeroboam immediately has a problem on his hands because the 10 northern tribes, they are still Israelites. They still worship God, and they still are required to go to Jerusalem and make their sacrifices at the temple every single year during the various festivals. Well, so that's going to be difficult now that they are actually in a different country. And so Jeroboam, he really reveals himself as a politician in this moment, because you read him talking about his fear that if all of his people annually are going back down into Judah and they are worshiping at the temple and they are rubbing shoulders with their former neighbors, that, you know what, maybe they're going to decide that they don't want me to be their king anymore and they want to go back into the fold of a united Israel. And so he makes some other plans for the worship of the people of the 10 northern tribes. And in a way, I guess you could say he sort of goes old school. Well, prior to the building of the first temple by Solomon, you would read that Israelites would worship God and make sacrifices at high places. So if you remember from episode 1, when I first introduced to you the prophet Samuel, who is accredited as the inspiration for the 2 books of Samuel, after Hannah, his mother, had him, then she committed to taking him to Shiloh, to a high place that was there, so that he could be raised by Eli. And then he, of course, would go on to himself become a prophet and the final judge of Israel. And so these high places were around there. That is where people went to worship God. So again, once the temple, though, is built under United Israel, all of those high places were supposed to come down. And so when you see Solomon building high places, and now Jeroboam goes and he makes the exact same mistake, this creates a problem, an everlasting permanent problem for all of ancient Israel. Jeroboam actually seems to go a little bit farther than even Solomon did. And it is stated that he casts 2 golden calves, and he places one in Bethel, a word that happens to mean the house of God, and he places another one in Dan, which is named after the tribe who lived there, the tribe of Dan. He puts those golden calves there. Then he goes on to build some sanctuary, temple-like structures in those areas. And he staffs those sanctuaries with people who are not Levites. Because it seems that most of the Levites, even after the split of the kingdoms, the Levites ended up staying in Jerusalem in that area so that they could continue to do the work at the temple. It makes sense that they stayed there. Well, so although there's disagreement over the exact location of Bethel, everybody knows where Tel Dan is. It's a fabulous site, and honestly, we talked about it last week with the Tel Dan stele, but we talked about a different part of it than we're going to talk about today. Because at Tel Dan, the high place that was built there has actually been discovered. If you go and you visit the site, then you will see the foundations of the structure that was there. And then there is a sort of a rendering, a representation that's made out of metal that represents the altar for burnt sacrifices that would have been there at the time. Again, go to those show notes, and I'm going to have links there to the site so that you can take a look at what is there at Tel Dan. In fact, more than just the sanctuary itself has been found. Also, cultic tools have been found there, and I think they called it like a tool kit. All of the different utensils for worship activities were found there, and based on what was discovered, it actually looks like Jeroboam and the priests who were doing the work there were actually trying their best to worship God as legally as they possibly could. Of course, the very core problem is no worship that happens outside of the temple in Jerusalem, once the temple in Jerusalem is built, is ever going to be legal. They are in the wrong place. The people doing it are not Levites. And of course, there is no Ark of the Covenant there. Instead, you have these golden calves that were placed there where the Ark of the Covenant was positioned at the Holy of Holies in the temple. So it is a little bit ironic that the Northern Kingdom was created as a result of Solomon's religious infidelity to God, and that this new kingdom that was created to sort of right the ship immediately does the exact same thing. They follow in his footsteps and honestly even take it further, it seems like. The first step away from proper worship is simply attempting to do it someplace other than Jerusalem. And then this beginning for them opens the door to more and more illegal behavior. The Northern Kingdom's 10 tribes, they ceased to be a nation about 150 years prior to the Southern Kingdom succumbing to Nebuchadnezzar. And that is because, according to the Bible, that is because of the way that they continued to mix with other cultures and worship other gods at various high places. As we move forward in this season, I'm going to do my best to talk about these two kingdoms as the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. I'm doing this for ease because the way the Bible refers to these two different areas can get really, really confusing really easily. When you're reading Kings, you really have to pay attention to what's going on and who they're talking about. Even at different times, some of the kings have same names. It can be very, very difficult because the Northern Kingdom, it's often called Israel. Just catch all Israel, but that only, after the division, that only refers to northern tribes, not to unified Israel. Although actually I think there are a few places it does. It's sometimes also called Ephraim because that is Jeroboam's tribe. So you see it being called that. Later on, a little bit later on, you see it being called the House of Omri. Omri is one of those kings who ended up having lots of descendants. The person who follows up Omri is actually a very famous individual named Ahab. And then of course, later on, it ends up being called Samaria. And this is something that carries through much, much later in time. Samaria becomes the capital of the Northern Kingdom. And so often you'll see the Northern Kingdom being called Samaria. Likewise, sometimes the Southern Kingdom will be called Jerusalem, after Jerusalem. We also see it being called Judah, obviously, after the tribe of Judah. And then, of course, the House of David, as we discussed last week. And sometimes, especially after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, the Southern Kingdom ends up getting called Israel. So I probably just made your head spin. I think I made mine spin a little bit too, because the biblical text uses all of these descriptive words for it, all of which are correct, historically accurate. There's nothing wrong with them, but it can be confusing to the reader, especially if you're just dipping in at certain points. If you're, not starting at the beginning of Kings and reading all the way through it, if you don't have the continuity of everything that's going on in between, you can get really confused. Like, okay, Samaria, are we talking about the city of Samaria? Are we talking about the nation of Samaria? So anyway, I'm going to do my best to stick to Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom. And when I'm talking about both, I will call it the United Kingdom or simply United Israel. I hope that will help us moving forward. Join me next week when we learn about the Northern Kingdom's most infamous king and queen, Ahab and Jezebel. We will talk more about high places and how the worship of foreign gods and goddesses affected Israel's politics and religion. The Red-Haired Archaeologist Podcast is researched, written, and recorded by me, Amanda Hope Haley. It is edited by Tanya Urenkiv. New episodes are released each Thursday. To interact with me and other listeners, make sure you click the follow button on the Red-Haired Archaeologist pages on Facebook and Instagram. Then check out my website at redhairedarchaeologist.com, where you can subscribe to my monthly email, order signed copies of all my books, and schedule me to come speak in your town.